7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
For over a century, some of the most brilliant code breakers in human history sat down with a single book and walked away with nothing. Even the team that cracked Nazi Germany's Enigma machine during World War II, the same people who broke a code the entire world thought was unbreakable, looked at this book and could not read a single page. Then, not long ago, a small university lab did something nobody had tried before. Instead of putting a historian or a linguist on the case, they pointed an artificial intelligence language model at the text instead, and what it found split the research world in half. This is the story of the one book that has broken every single person who has ever tried to read it. The book itself is real, and you can go see it yourself. It sits inside Yale University's rare book and manuscript library, cataloged simply as Manuscript 408. Around 240 pages of animal skin parchment, called vellum, filled edge to edge with flowing, elegant handwriting in a script that does not match any known language on Earth. In 2009, scientists at the University of Arizona took 4 samples of that parchment and ran radiocarbon dating on them, and the results came back with 95% certainty. The vellum was made sometime between 1404 and 1438, which places the physical book firmly in the late Middle Ages in Europe, centuries before the printing press had even reached most of the continent. And the pages are not just text, they are covered in strange illustrations, plants that do not match any species known to botany, star charts and zodiac diagrams, circular patterns some researchers call rosettes, small jars that look almost pharmaceutical, naked women bathing in interconnected pools linked by strange tubes, and dense blocks of text that some scholars believe might be recipes or instructions. Historians have sorted the manuscript into 6 loose sections, based purely on these pictures, because for 600 years, nobody could read a single word attached to any of them. That much is agreed upon by almost everyone who has ever studied the book. The moment anyone tries to explain what the actual words mean, the fighting starts, and that fight is exactly what pulled artificial intelligence into this story. In January of 2018, a computer scientist named Greg Kondrak, working alongside his graduate student Bradley Hauer at the University of Alberta, decided to try something nobody had attempted before. Rather than trying to translate the manuscript's words directly, they built an algorithm designed to first identify what language the text might have originated from. Their method involved feeding the algorithm the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, translated into roughly 400 different languages, and then comparing the statistical patterns in those documents against the patterns found in the Voynich script itself. Their early hypothesis was that the manuscript might be written in Arabic. When they ran the algorithm, the result pointed somewhere else entirely. Hebrew came back as the strongest match. From there, the two researchers built a theory around something called alphagrams, the idea that each word in the manuscript might actually be a scrambled version of a real word, with its letters rearranged the same way an anagram works. That shift from Arabic to Hebrew was already a surprise nobody in the field expected from a piece of software. But what happened when they applied that Hebrew hypothesis to an actual sentence in the manuscript is what made headlines around the world. Using their alphagram method combined with Google Translate, Kondrak and Hauer produced what appeared to be one coherent, readable sentence taken from the opening lines of the manuscript. Once unscrambled and translated, it read roughly as follows. She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and to the people. Kondrak told reporters the sentence was grammatically sound and could be interpreted, and he called it a genuine breakthrough. After literally hundreds of years of total silence from this text, news outlets moved fast. Fox News ran a headline declaring the manuscript finally decoded. Canadian outlets picked it up. Global News sat down and interviewed Kondrak directly about the discovery. For a few days, it looked like one of history's most stubborn, unsolved mysteries had finally cracked open, and it had happened because of a university computer lab, rather than a team of historians. That excitement did not survive very long, once other experts in the field actually examined how that single sentence had been produced. What followed became one of the most public academic disputes the Voynich research community had seen in years. Within days, a medievalist named Damian Fleming at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, publicly criticized the finding on social media. His objection was not with the language identification portion of the study, which used solid, defensible statistical methods. His objection was with the final translation step, where the team leaned on Google Translate, a tool built to handle modern Hebrew, to interpret words that might be over 600 years old, and scrambled on top of that. Other critics pointed out that no expert in historical or ancient Hebrew had ever been brought in to verify the actual meaning of the sentence, something Kondrak himself later admitted would be necessary before anyone could call the manuscript's meaning confirmed. Longtime Voynich researchers were quick to point out that this was not new. Dozens of people across the decades had announced similar breakthroughs, only to have their claims quietly fade away once nobody else could reproduce the results. That exact pattern, a huge public announcement followed by a fast correction, repeated itself again barely a year later, this time with an entire university institution standing behind the claim. In May of 2019, the University of Bristol issued a press release announcing that one of its own researchers, a man named Gerard Cheshire, had cracked the manuscript's code in just 2 weeks. Cheshire claimed the text was written in an extinct language he called Proto-Romance, an early spoken form of Latin that predated modern languages like Italian and Spanish. His paper, published in the journal Romance Studies, claimed the manuscript covered topics like women's health, herbal remedies, and therapeutic bathing practices. News outlets from CNN to the BBC ran the story within hours. Then the backlash arrived even faster than it had for the AI study the year before. Lisa Fagan Davis, executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, publicly called the entire proto-romance theory nonsense, explaining that she had tried to reproduce Cheshire's exact method years earlier and found it fell apart the moment anyone attempted to apply it consistently. She explained that the letter substitutions Cheshire relied on were essentially subjective, meaning a researcher could bend the same symbols into whatever result they were hoping to find. Within a day, the University of Bristol pulled the article from its own website, stating that concerns had been raised about the validity of the research. 2 major, loudly publicized claims in 2 separate years, both quickly and publicly walked back by outside experts. But there is a third theory circling this manuscript, one stranger than either of the language claims, because it argues the book might not need translating at all, since there may be nothing real inside it to translate in the first place. In 2004, a researcher named Gordon Rugg proposed something completely different from a language-based theory. He argued the text could have been generated using a device called a cardon grill, a piece of cardboard with holes cut into it that could be slid over a table filled with word fragments, prefixes, stems, and suffixes. Line the grill up over the right columns and you can mechanically generate word after word that looks statistically like a real language, without any of it carrying actual meaning. Rugg pointed to the manuscript's unusual and oddly consistent word length pattern as evidence supporting this kind of mechanical process, since natural human languages rarely behave in such a rigid, even way. There is, however, a serious problem with the timeline. The cardon grill was invented by Girolamo Cardano in 1550. More than a century after the manuscript's vellum has been radiocarbon dated to between 1404 and 1438. Rugg has attempted to work around this gap by suggesting either that an earlier version of the grill existed and was lost to history, or that the manuscript itself was written later than the vellum it is written on, using old parchment stock that had simply been sitting around unused for decades. That timeline gap has never been fully resolved by anyone on either side of the hoax argument, and it connects directly to a deeper puzzle buried inside the letters and words themselves, one that neither the AI study nor the hoax theory can fully explain away. Researchers studying the manuscript's raw text applied a mathematical concept called information entropy, which measures how predictable a piece of writing actually is. Random gibberish tends to score extremely high on this measure, since nothing about it follows any consistent pattern. Real human languages score much lower, because certain letters and word structures repeat constantly according to grammar. The Voynich script scores low, too, sitting much closer to the behavior of a real language than to random noise. Its words also follow strict internal rules about which characters are allowed to appear at the beginning, middle, or end of a word, closely resembling grammatical rules found in genuine languages. This is exactly the kind of pattern that keeps serious researchers convinced there is real meaning buried somewhere in the text. It is also, strangely, the same kind of pattern that Rugg's card and grill method can accidentally recreate through a purely mechanical process with no meaning behind it at all. Both sides of the argument can point to the exact same statistical evidence and walk away with completely opposite conclusions. That same contradiction follows the manuscript back through history, because its ownership trail is just as murky and unresolved as its text. The earliest confirmed owner on record is Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who ruled from 1576 to 1612, and reportedly purchased the manuscript for 600 gold ducats, believing at the time that it had been written by the medieval English philosopher Roger Bacon. That specific claim comes from a letter written decades later by a Prague physician named Johannes Marcus Marci, addressed to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome. No record inside the actual imperial account books confirms that Rudolph ever made this purchase, which has led some historians to treat the 600 ducats story as legend rather than documented fact. From Rudolph, the book is believed to have passed to his court pharmacist and eventually to an alchemist named Georg Barisch, who also could not read it and begged Kircher for help, translating it back in 1639. After Barisch died, Marci inherited the manuscript and shipped it off to Kircher in 1665, along with his now famous letter describing its history. The book then vanished from public record for roughly 2 centuries, resurfacing in 1912 when a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich discovered it inside a chest at Villa Mondragone, a Jesuit college near Rome, and purchased it on the spot. Even Voynich's own account of finding the manuscript contains small inconsistencies when compared against a later version of the story written by his wife, and that detail alone is part of why one final theory refuses to disappear completely: the possibility that the entire manuscript is a hoax created far more recently than anyone assumes, and that Wilfrid Voynich made it himself. A small number of researchers have floated the idea that Voynich created the manuscript sometime between 1900 and 1912, using genuinely old vellum scraps to fake an ancient appearance, then inventing the script and illustrations from scratch to increase the value of a mysterious discovery on the antiquarian book market. Voynich had a colorful past involving forged passports and revolutionary political activity earlier in his life, something supporters of this theory point to as evidence he had the exact skill set required for this kind of deception. They also point to the manuscript's handwriting, which appears remarkably uniform throughout the entire book, unlike most genuine medieval manuscripts, which were typically copied by several different scribes working together in a shared workshop. The 2009 radiocarbon dating result remains the single biggest obstacle for this particular theory, since it confirms the vellum itself genuinely dates back to the early 1400s, centuries before Voynich was even born. That one scientific test does not completely eliminate every version of the forgery idea, since old vellum could theoretically have been reused later by a forger working with authentic antique materials. But it does mean the most commonly repeated version of the hoax theory runs directly into a very hard piece of physical evidence standing in its way. So what does all of this actually add up to? After the artificial intelligence language study, the Bristol proto-romance claim, the card and grill hoax theory, the entropy research, and over a century of ownership records full of unexplained gaps, nobody has ever produced a translation that other independent experts can confirm. The work from Kondrak and Hauer gave researchers a genuinely useful clue, a real, statistically grounded pointer toward Hebrew as a possible root language, published in a legitimate peer-reviewed journal called Transactions of the Association for Computational Linguistics. But the single sentence that made headlines around the world leaned on a modern translation tool never designed to handle a text that might be 600 years old and deliberately scrambled. Kondrak himself acknowledged that full confirmation would require an expert in ancient Hebrew, willing to take on the rest of the puzzle. Work that, as far as public record shows, has still never happened. The Bristol claim collapsed within days, under nearly identical scrutiny. The hoax theory runs headfirst into its own hard wall in the form of the radiocarbon dating. What the evidence actually supports is neither a solved mystery nor a fully proven hoax. It supports a manuscript that keeps producing patterns real enough to tempt some of the most capable researchers alive, and complicated enough to quietly dismantle every single claim of victory that has ever been made against it. If you want more deep dives into mysteries the world has never fully solved, subscribing costs nothing and keeps stories exactly like this one coming.